Hello friends, welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Han. I'm a hand embroidery artist and small business owner, and I make a lot of embroidery tutorials here on YouTube, mostly centered around footwear, and today's video is a hand embroidered boot tutorial. I actually embroidered these for a collaboration giveaway a couple of months ago, and I've just now gotten around to editing this video and posting it. So these boots are knockout boots from Thursday Boot Company. I absolutely love their boots. They're so comfortable. I own like 3 pairs at this point, all hand embroidered of course. And something I love to do to Chelsea boots that have this little elasticated ankle piece is to just add some really cute embroidery. And around the time we did this collaboration giveaway, it was the fall season. So this design is very much fall focused, autumn colors. All of the threads that I will be using in this project are DMC threads. All of their numbers are on their bobbins that I've wound them onto. You can buy much cheaper embroidery thread on Amazon that actually uses the exact same color key guide as DMC. You will be needing some finger protectors. I like to use these silicone ones. They go on super easy. They come in a bunch of different sizes and they make it really easy to pull the needle through the fabric, and at the same time they do protect the skin on your fingertips. I'll be listing all of the other supplies I use in this video, like my scissors and my needles, just in case you also need to grab those. Those will be in the description of this video. So the first thing we're going to go in and stitch are the stems of the longer daisies. So for these stems we're going to be using 2 strands of the 3782 color. There are 2 longer stems on this design, and then those longer stems also have some offshoots. So what I'm doing is a relatively long back stitch, or straight stitch you could call it, and then just to anchor it to the material a little bit more, I'm doing some smaller anchor stitches, which are just really tiny stitches along the line of the stem just to secure it down against the fabric. I actually prefer the way this looks to back stitches most of the time. A lot of the times embroidery artists will do a bunch of tiny back stitches for stems and stuff like that. I prefer how it looks with slightly larger stitches but then anchoring them as you go. Just feel like it looks a little bit more cohesive, and you can't really see the breaks in the stitches as much as you can with tiny back stitches, if that makes sense. So the same process for the little offshoot branches on these stems, and I've tried to make this tutorial as in-depth as possible, so I have filmed almost every single stitch that I make on these boots. I myself am definitely a visual learner, and I know that beginners to the craft tend to find it really helpful when people go into extreme depth and show them every single step. So I've tried to do that with this video because I do like my videos to be beginner friendly. So if you're a slightly more seasoned embroidery artist and you're watching this like, oh my goodness, she doesn't need to show us all of this, feel free to put the video in 2 times speed, or just skip to the next part if you have got a certain stitch down or you know exactly what you're doing. Don't forget to also anchor those smaller branches, those little offshoots on the main stem. Don't forget to anchor those down as well. Just a couple anchor stitches in each of the longer stitches that you make for the stem and the offshoot. And now we're going to be moving on to the leaves that come off of these stems. We're actually going to be using 4 strands of thread in this exact same color that we used for the stems themselves. And for these leaves, we are going to be using the satin stitch. And I always recommend about 4 to 5, maybe even 6 stitches for each leaf, just to make them look nice and plump and full. I like a little bit more of a 3D look for my leaves. I like them to sit on top of the fabric a little bit and kind of contrast themselves from the stem, if that makes sense. As you can see, when you're working with a thicker density of thread, so here we're using 4 strands, whereas just for the stem we were only using 2, it's much easier for the thread to knot and to catch on itself when it's traveling through the fabric. Just be aware of this, and you know, if it does happen to you, if your thread does knot and tangle a little bit, just handle it with care, handle it gently. You don't want to pull and break the thread. I usually find it best to just go in at the point where the thread seems to be knotting and just pull gently upwards, and then try and pull it back down through the fabric again gently. If you do pull hard on the thread when it has knotted, it might break, or you might have to go in and just cut away and start again, rethread your needle and start stitching again from that exact area. So once you're done with the first stem, go ahead onto the other stem. Don't forget to add a little leaf on each of the offshoots that you embroidered onto the stems. Again, we want to do multiple of these satin stitches to make the leaves look as plump and full as possible. Don't be afraid to really spend some time on these stems and these leaves, because these are kind of the biggest design component in this full embroidery design. They're the tallest stems, they're the biggest leaves, so really want to make sure they come out nice and tidy. And as you can see, I'm actually coming to the end of my thread right here. It's becoming quite short. So I just want to mention how you're going to tie your thread off and the inside of the boot, since it's really hard for me to get a camera angle on that because the opening at the top of the boot is not very wide. So when it does come time for you to either change your thread or just to tie it off between stitches, you're just going to loop your needle around the inner stitches inside the boot that you've already made. Do that a couple of times and then do that an extra 2 or 3 times, but make a knot in those loops. And obviously pull that taut and then trim off any excess thread that is left behind after that, and then those stitches are secure and they won't be going anywhere. The next thread color we're going to use is this 3032 color. We're going to be stitching some smaller stems, which are just exactly the same stitch as the first stitch we did for the first stems, but on a smaller scale. So you only need to do 1 stitch, but still make sure you anchor this once or twice. Again, it's exactly the same process, but just for a shorter stem. And then onto these shorter stems, we're going to be adding some leaves, exactly like we did with the first leaves. These are just going to be on a slightly smaller scale. But again, you'll need to stitch a satin stitch at least 3 or 4 times. I like to do maybe 4 or 5 stitches for these leaves. Again, I do like my leaves a little bit plumper. I like them to sit nicely on top of the fabric and to have a little bit of a 3D effect. So I do recommend at least 3 or 4 satin stitches for these leaves. And not everything we stitch onto these stems is going to be a leaf. Some of them are just going to be little single branches, and for those you'll just need to do 1 single straight stitch, as if you were just going to do a really thin leaf with 1 satin stitch, but since it's just 1 stitch, it'll just be called a straight stitch. Repeat this process with the stems, the leaves, and the little single branches. For all 3 of these little accent stems we have at the bottom of the shoe here, we're going to be adding little accent buds later onto those little branches, so make sure you remember those are really important to add in. The next thread color we're going in with is this blanc color, which is just a really nice off-white color, and we're going to be using that to stitch the daisy petals. We're using all 6 strands of this embroidery thread, so just be careful. As I said in the beginning, the thicker the strand density you use, the higher the possibility it is that the thread will snag and knot on its way through the fabric. So just be aware of this and take your time with these daisies. So for each daisy, we're going to be doing 12 petals, and we're just going to be doing a straight stitch for each one of these petals. It's super simple, but it comes out super beautiful in the end. Simple but effective, I like to say. Next, we're going to go in with 2 strands of the 729 thread, and we're going to be stitching the pollen on the inside of the daisy petals we just stitched. We're going to be using the French knot stitch, which is a slightly more advanced stitch technique. So you'll need to insert your needle up through the center of the daisy and wrap your thread around that needle twice before sticking it back down through the center of the daisy. Keep your thumb on that thread as you pull it down through the fabric, just to control the flow of thread and to prevent any extra knots. So now we're going to be using the 842 color, and we're going to be stitching those accent buds I talked about earlier onto the smaller stems. Again, same process as the daisy pollen. We're going to be using 3 strands of this thread, and you're going to be wrapping this thread around the needle 3 times as opposed to 2 times as we did with the daisy pollen. This just creates slightly larger French knots, and always remember to keep your thumb on that thread as you are pulling the thread through the fabric. It just ensures that your French knot turns out really neat and tidy, and it just leaves no room for error. So the last stems that we're going to be stitching are in this same color. So rather than stitch all of the French knots and then go back in and stitch these stems, I decided to stitch the stems as I was stitching the French knots. And again, the same exact stitching process, 1 straight stitch down and a couple of anchoring stitches. There's going to be no leaves or branches on these stems, so just a pretty straightforward process to stitch these. We're going to be going in with 3 strands of the 3826 color, and we're going to be stitching some half flowers on top of those stems we just stitched. So we want these flowers to look like they're growing upwards. The pollen is going to be sitting on the apex of these petals on top of the flower. And for these petals, we're doing the exact same stitch as we did for the lazy daisy stitches, but we're going to be overlapping our stitches, which makes this a satin stitch. So once you're done with those 3 petal flowers, we're going to go in and add the pollen at the very top of those flowers. And again, we'll be using the French knot stitch, and we're actually going to be using the blanc color that we used for the daisy petals, and we're just going to be using 2 strands of this, and we're going to be wrapping it around our needle twice for the French knot. And again, we're going to be doing that at the apex of each of these 3 petal orange flowers, and that is going to be our last stitch of this project. Here are some close-ups of how this design turned out. I absolutely love the color scheme, and I think the design looks so natural on these shoes. I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that maybe it has given you the tools you need to try a project like this at home. If you did enjoy this video, or you will be trying this project at home yourself, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to this channel. I do share a lot of hand embroidery tutorials and small business related content. I would absolutely love to have you join our crafty little corner of the internet. Thanks again so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next video.